The military courtroom was tense with anticipation, the air thick with a mixture of authority and formality. Judge Robert Mitchell, a white officer with years of experience, stood at the front, preparing to oversee another routine hearing. A career military man, Mitchell had seen it all: disputes over orders, miscommunication, and the occasional disciplinary issue. Today, however, he wasn't prepared for what would unfold. He had no reason to think this case would be any different. Captain Olivia Thomas, a black woman with a commanding presence, stood at attention in the defendant's seat. She wasn't easily intimidated, even by the intimidating atmosphere of the courtroom. Her uniform, immaculate and perfectly fitted, spoke of years of dedication and discipline. She had earned her place through years of hard work and sacrifice, and despite being only in her mid-30s, she held a rank that many could only dream of reaching. However, today, she found herself at the center of scrutiny, accused of disobeying a direct order from a superior officer. Mitchell glanced at the folder on his desk, containing the details of the case. It seemed straightforward enough. Captain Thomas had failed to follow an order during a mission, one that could have led to a potential breach of protocol. The situation, according to the report, had escalated quickly, and Thomas had made a snap decision to override the order, thinking it would ultimately save lives. But the higher-ups didn't share her assessment. According to them, she had acted outside of her authority, and now she stood before Mitchell to answer for it. With a slight tilt of his head, Mitchell called the courtroom to order. "Captain Thomas, you are here today to answer for disobeying a direct order," he said, his voice steady and formal. "The charge carries serious consequences. How do you plead?" Thomas's gaze remained steady as she addressed the judge. "Your Honor, I respectfully plead not guilty to the charge," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I took action in the heat of the moment, but I did so in the best interest of the mission and the lives of those involved. I was faced with a difficult choice, and I believe my decision was justified." Mitchell raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. He had heard similar justifications many times before. In his experience, most officers who had been accused of similar charges were simply looking for an excuse to avoid punishment. He crossed his arms, looking at Thomas as though she were just another case to clear off his docket. "I see," he said, his tone skeptical. "Well, Captain, I'll be the one to determine whether your actions were justified. Let's proceed." Thomas met his gaze without flinching, and despite the tension, she remained poised. She knew the outcome wasn't looking in her favor, but she wasn't about to back down. This wasn't just about her. It was about proving that there was more at play here than a simple mistake. Mitchell, on the other hand, continued to review the details in his mind, his judgment clouded by the belief that this was a simple case of insubordination. Little did he know that the true complexity of the situation had only begun to unfold. Captain Thomas stood tall, her hands clasped in front of her, every inch the professional. Her eyes never wavered from the judge, even as Mitchell scanned the room, barely meeting her gaze. It was clear to her that the judge wasn't fully listening. His focus seemed more on making a decision than hearing her out. But Thomas was prepared. She had faced challenges like this before, and her experience taught her to remain steady even when the odds were stacked against her. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady, "I acknowledge the order I received, but I would like to explain the circumstances that led to my actions. When I was given the order to proceed with the mission as planned, I had intelligence suggesting that following it would result in unnecessary casualties on both sides. I made a judgment call based on that information. It was not insubordination. It was an effort to save lives." There was no drama in her words, no exaggeration, just a calm, reasoned explanation, the kind of response that typically commanded respect. Yet Mitchell seemed unimpressed, his fingers drumming lightly on the wooden bench as he absorbed her words with a detached air. "Saving lives, Captain?" he questioned, his tone dismissive. "The military operates on orders. You may not like them, but disobeying them creates chaos. Your decision to ignore a direct order undermines the chain of command. There are protocols for these kinds of situations. Did you follow those protocols? Thomas didn't flinch at the question. She had anticipated this response. I did follow the protocols, sir, she replied evenly. I communicated my concerns to my superior officer and requested clarification on the order. When I was told to carry on despite my objections, I made the decision to take action in the best interest of the mission. I did not act impulsively or out of defiance. I acted with the safety of my team in mind. Mitchell leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing slightly as he took in her words. He wasn't sure if he was convinced, but what bothered him was how calm and composed she seemed. She spoke as though this was just another day at the office, as if defying orders to protect lives was a normal, justified part of military service. And yet, something in the back of his mind niggled at him. Was there more to this than he realized? Thomas continued, unaffected by the judge's growing skepticism. I understand the seriousness of this charge, Your Honor, she said. But I ask you to consider the bigger picture. The military is about more than blind obedience. It's about making decisions that protect and preserve the integrity of the mission. My actions were not driven by personal pride or a desire to undermine authority, but by my responsibility as a leader to ensure the safety of those under my command. Mitchell's lips pressed into a thin line. He didn't like what he was hearing. He was used to officers who fell in line without questioning, who never challenged authority. The more Thomas spoke, the more it seemed like she was challenging the very nature of his understanding of duty. He wanted to dismiss her words as just another defense, but there was something in her eyes, a quiet confidence, that made him hesitate. But Mitchell had a job to do, and he had already decided. A fine was coming. He just needed to wrap this up. With a slight nod, he turned to the rest of the courtroom, signaling that the defense would be dismissed for the time being. Thank you, Captain, he said curtly, his voice lacking the empathy she had hoped for. We'll resume in a moment. But in the back of his mind, something was already starting to stir. The courtroom remained quiet as Captain Thomas took her seat, her back straight and her gaze unwavering. Judge Mitchell shuffled through the papers on his desk, preparing to make a decision. He glanced once more at the report detailing her alleged violation, mentally weighing the evidence and considering the severity of the charge. He had already made up his mind. He would impose a fine. Nothing too drastic, but enough to make a statement. After all, it was his role to uphold order, and in Mitchell's view, disobedience of any form was a threat to that order. As he sifted through the documents, an aide entered the courtroom quietly, holding a file in his hands. Mitchell barely looked up as the aide approached his desk and placed the file in front of him. The aide whispered something briefly in his ear, but Mitchell didn't catch the words. His mind was already focused on the matter at hand, preparing to close the case. He reached for the file without thinking, assuming it was a procedural matter, just another document to sign off on. But as his eyes scanned the paper, his fingers froze. Wait a second, Mitchell muttered under his breath, his gaze narrowing as he reread the document. A brief silence followed. He read it again, slower this time, as the realization slowly settled in. The paper he was holding was a personnel record, one that had not been on his radar earlier. It listed Captain Olivia Thomas's military rank, her full rank, and what he had failed to notice earlier was that she had recently received a promotion. His eyes widened as he took in the information. Captain Thomas was no longer just another officer. She was now a lieutenant colonel, a rank that placed her above him in the military hierarchy. Mitchell blinked, as if the words on the page might change. But they didn't. The weight of the revelation hit him like a ton of bricks. Captain Thomas was not just another officer under his jurisdiction. She was his superior. His heart skipped a beat. How had he missed this? How could he have overlooked something so important? A cold rush of embarrassment flooded his chest, followed by a wave of disbelief. Had he really been so focused on his preconceived notions that he had failed to properly review her rank? How could he have made such a fundamental mistake? Mitchell felt the room close in around him, the silence suddenly suffocating. The walls seemed to press in as the realization sank deeper into his gut. His immediate reaction was a mix of shock and confusion, quickly followed by the recognition of how his own bias might have clouded his judgment. In his mind, a black woman in her 30s, especially one with a leadership role, could never outrank him. He had assumed that this case, like many others, was one where a more junior officer would be disciplined for insubordination. But now it was clear. He was wrong. He glanced up at the courtroom, where Captain Thomas sat quietly, her expression unchanged. She had been calm throughout the proceedings, but Mitchell could now sense a shift. He wondered how long she had known that he was unaware of her true rank. Had she been waiting for him to make this discovery? Had she known all along that he was about to make a huge mistake? His mind raced as he tried to process everything. There was no going back now. The reality of the situation was undeniable. He had just made a serious error in judgment. Mitchell's heart raced as he continued to stare at the personnel record in front of him. His fingers tightened around the paper, his knuckles going white, but he couldn't tear his gaze away. The words jumped out at him. Lieutenant Colonel Olivia Thomas. It felt like a punch to the gut. He had spent the past hour formulating a verdict, certain in his judgment. Now, in a single moment, it all unraveled. How had he missed this? It should have been obvious, especially given her presence and her confident demeanor. But in his mind, the idea that a black woman could outrank him had never crossed his mind. He had been so quick to categorize her, to dismiss her defense as another officer making excuses, that he never even bothered to check her rank properly. The shame of the oversight hit him hard, deeper than he expected. He had underestimated her in ways he hadn't realized, and now it was painfully clear that he had made a serious mistake. Mitchell's eyes flicked nervously to the courtroom, where Captain Thomas sat, as still as ever. She hadn't moved a muscle since the end of her defense. He wondered, in that moment, if she had been fully aware of his mistake all along. Had she known he would fail to see her rank? Or was she simply waiting for him to figure it out for himself? Either way, the situation had shifted completely. His role as the presiding judge now felt hollow, a fragile authority that could be toppled in an instant by the very person he had been about to sentence. As the room grew quieter, Mitchell became acutely aware of his own discomfort. The weight of his mistake loomed large. He tried to shake off the gnawing feeling of guilt, but it stuck to him like a shadow. What had he done? He had allowed his own biases, his assumptions about authority and rank, shaped by years of ingrained prejudices, to cloud his judgment. And now his professional integrity was in question. The silence in the courtroom felt unbearable. Mitchell cleared his throat, but his voice, when it finally came, sounded hollow. "Captain Thomas," he began, his tone noticeably different from earlier. He paused, unsure how to proceed. He had been so quick to dismiss her, so sure of his own authority, and now he was unsure how to face her. Thomas didn't respond immediately. Instead, she sat there, unmoving, her eyes steady and calm. There was something about her unshakable demeanor that both intimidated and intrigued him. She had not raised her voice once during the proceedings, had not demanded attention or sympathy. She was simply a leader, not a woman seeking to prove herself, and that struck Mitchell more than anything. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of uncomfortable silence, Captain Thomas spoke, her voice soft but firm. "Your Honor," she said, pausing briefly before continuing, "I believe there has been a misunderstanding." Mitchell's stomach twisted. The words were simple, but the weight of them hung in the air. She wasn't angry, nor was she raising her voice in outrage. She was merely stating the obvious, the truth that he had failed to see until now. And that truth stung more than any reprimand could. Mitchell cleared his throat again, this time with more effort. "Yes," he said, his voice faltering slightly. "It seems that way." The words hung in the air between them, sharp and heavy. Mitchell shifted uncomfortably in his seat, trying to regain some semblance of control, but his mind was clouded. The realization of his blunder was suffocating, and he struggled to find the right words to salvage the situation. He cleared his throat again, his gaze flicking nervously to the document in front of him. "Captain Thomas," he began, his voice slightly more measured, "it appears I've misjudged the situation." The words felt foreign in his mouth, awkward and incomplete. His confidence had been shattered, and now, in the face of his own mistake, he was unsure how to proceed. Thomas didn't react with anger or frustration, but there was a subtle shift in her posture, a slight narrowing of her eyes. Her response came not with a defensive or accusatory tone, but with a quiet, controlled strength that only made Mitchell feel more aware of his failings. She could have demanded that he correct his error right away, but she didn't. Instead, she spoke with the calm authority of someone who had dealt with situations like this before, who understood that power was not always about asserting control, but about knowing when to stand firm. "Your Honor," she said slowly, her voice steady but firm, "I believe it's important to address this oversight now, before we go any further." Mitchell felt his cheeks flush. He had hoped that the momentary silence between them could be filled with some sort of excuse or justification on his part. But Captain Thomas wasn't giving him that opportunity. She wasn't interested in letting this slide. This was a matter of integrity, of respect, and she was making it clear that her position had to be acknowledged. "I believe," she continued, her gaze unflinching, "that you are aware of the error in your judgment regarding my rank. Lieutenant Colonel Thomas, as you now know, is the proper address. I've worked hard to get to this position, and I've earned the respect that comes with it. You've acted quickly to make your decision, and I understand that the system sometimes requires swift action. But we must also remember that decisions made in haste can lead to misunderstandings, especially when we don't take the time to fully understand the facts." Mitchell felt the weight of her words more than any reprimand could have conveyed. It wasn't her words themselves that stung, but the quiet authority with which she delivered them. This wasn't a reprimand. It was a statement of fact, one that he could neither dismiss nor escape. For a brief moment, Mitchell thought he might try to salvage his position by arguing his intentions, by explaining that the fine was meant as a simple consequence for the action, nothing personal. But as he glanced up at Captain Thomas, he realized she was not interested in his excuses. She wasn't looking for an apology. She was simply asserting her rightful place. "I understand," Mitchell said, his voice more composed now, though it carried a hint of regret. "It was an oversight on my part. I failed to properly review your record, and for that, I apologize." Thomas nodded, but there was no sign of satisfaction in her expression. She wasn't here for his apology. She was here to ensure that the system worked as it was meant to. "Thank you," she replied simply. "But what happens next is important. You have the chance to correct this, to move forward with a fair judgment. That is what matters now." Mitchell nodded slowly, realizing she wasn't going to let this mistake be swept under the rug. She expected more than just words. She expected him to show that he could rise above his assumptions and biases and do what was right, regardless of his position. The weight of his error became even more evident. This wasn't just about one case or one person. It was about the integrity of the system, the trust that was built on fairness and respect. As Mitchell sat back in his chair, contemplating the gravity of the situation, he realized that this wasn't just an opportunity to fix one mistake. It was a chance to change the way he saw the world around him. And as much as he hated to admit it, Captain Thomas had just shown him a path forward. The courtroom was still, save for the soft shuffle of papers on Mitchell's desk. His fingers were now pressed to his forehead, as if trying to stave off the pounding headache building from the weight of his realization. He could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on him, the tension palpable. It wasn't just about the case anymore. It was about something far more significant. The integrity of the system, his own judgment, and his willingness to confront his mistakes were all now under scrutiny. Captain Thomas sat calmly, her posture as rigid and commanding as ever, but there was a sense of quiet power in the way she held herself. She had done nothing to provoke his error, yet she had been the one to bear the brunt of it. And now, in front of the entire courtroom, she was showing him a level of composure he found difficult to match. For a long moment, Mitchell said nothing. He didn't know what to say. Every word he'd prepared in his mind suddenly felt hollow, inadequate. What was there to say when he'd failed so spectacularly? What could he possibly say that would make up for his assumption, his dismissal of her as just another officer? The silence stretched, only adding to the gravity of the situation. Finally, he spoke, his voice low but clear. "Captain Thomas," he began, his words measured. "I made an error, a serious one, and I want to acknowledge it openly." He paused, the weight of the room making it hard to continue. But there was no escaping the truth now, and he had to say it. "I didn't give you the respect you deserve. I didn't check your rank as I should have, and I didn't listen to you as thoroughly as I should have. For that, I am deeply sorry." The apology wasn't dramatic. There was no attempt to soften the blow, no extraneous words to disguise the fact that Mitchell had made a mistake. He wasn't asking for forgiveness. He was simply acknowledging his failure. Thomas's gaze remained steady, unwavering, but there was a slight softening in her eyes. She didn't need his apology to validate her position, but the fact that he had taken responsibility spoke volumes. It was an admission of humility, something that, in his experience, was rare in the military, especially from someone in his position. Mitchell took a deep breath, trying to compose himself. He had always prided himself on being a man of principle, someone who made decisions based on what was right. But this moment had shown him how easy it was to fall into the trap of assumption and prejudice. The sting of that realization was sharp, but it also became the catalyst for change. "I will reconsider my decision," he said, his voice firm but not without the trace of self-doubt that lingered. "I will review this case properly, as it deserves to be, and I will ensure that any further judgment reflects not just the facts of the situation, but also the respect due to every individual in this room." The words weren't a complete fix to the mess he had made, but they were a step toward making things right. He knew that trust couldn't be restored overnight, but this was a start. He had learned a lesson he would never forget, one that would change how he viewed his role as a judge and how he saw the people who appeared before him. Captain Thomas met his gaze, and for the first time in the session, a small, almost imperceptible nod of approval passed between them. It wasn't a sign of forgiveness. It was a recognition of something much more profound, an understanding that, despite his failure, Mitchell was willing to grow. That, in itself, was a victory. Later that evening, in the solitude of his office, Judge Mitchell sat at his desk, the room dimly lit by the glow of a single desk lamp. The door was closed, and the silence around him felt oppressive. He had sent the court adjourned early, needing time to think, to process everything that had transpired that day. His hands were clasped together, his elbows resting on the edge of the desk, as he stared at the pile of paperwork in front of him without really seeing it. The image of Captain Thomas remained etched in his mind. Her poise, her confidence, her ability to confront him without aggression, without any hint of personal animosity. It had all left a lasting impression. But more than that, it was the recognition of his own blind spots that weighed heavily on him now. He had spent the entirety of the case assuming she was just another officer, someone who could be dismissed as easily as any other. And then, with one simple realization, his world tilted. He had made a judgment based on his own assumptions, prejudices that he hadn't even realized he was carrying. He had failed to see her as an equal, let alone someone who had earned her rank through hard work and sacrifice. It was a painful realization for someone like Mitchell, a man who had prided himself on being fair and impartial, a man who had spent years in the military, convinced that he was above such biases, yet in the most basic sense, he had acted out of them. The apology he had offered earlier in court still felt awkward in his mind, but it had been necessary. He hadn't just owed her an apology for his mistake. He owed it to himself as well. The fact that he had made the error, that he had misjudged her, reflected something deeper in him. a tendency to see the world through a narrow lens, one that hadn't been challenged until today. Mitchell leaned back in his chair, letting out a slow breath. He had always prided himself on his objectivity, but today, his objectivity had failed him. He knew that if he wanted to be the judge he claimed to be, if he wanted to be the person who truly upheld the law, he had to look beyond his own narrow experiences and biases. He had to challenge himself, to learn and grow. Over the next few days, Mitchell took it upon himself to review his past cases. He pored over the decisions he had made, scrutinizing them for any sign of favoritism, bias, or assumptions he may have let influence his rulings. It wasn't easy, and there were moments when the weight of the task felt overwhelming. But Mitchell knew it was necessary. This was his chance to fix the blind spots that had influenced his decision-making, to ensure that no officer, no person, would ever find themselves subject to the same kind of oversight again. The experience with Captain Thomas had humbled him in a way he hadn't anticipated. It had forced him to face the uncomfortable truth about his own shortcomings, and that truth was a powerful catalyst for change. In his mind, the lesson was clear. Judgment wasn't just about the facts in front of you. It was about recognizing the people who stood behind those facts and respecting their humanity. It wasn't a lesson he would forget anytime soon. And as the days passed, Mitchell found himself becoming more determined than ever to not just be a judge, but to be a better one. He understood now that true leadership wasn't about rank or authority. It was about humility, fairness, and the ability to see beyond one's own perspective. For the first time in a long while, Mitchell felt the quiet stirrings of something more profound than just duty. He felt the spark of genuine change. Weeks passed, and Judge Mitchell found himself making subtle yet significant changes in the way he approached his role. The experience with Captain Thomas had shifted something deep within him. It wasn't just a matter of admitting to a mistake. It was about unlearning the biases he hadn't realized were influencing his decisions. He had spent years climbing the ranks of the military, honing his skills, and trusting his experience, but he had never fully examined the lens through which he viewed the world. Now, after facing his own shortcomings, he was determined to do better, not just for himself, but for the integrity of the system he served. Mitchell's interactions with his colleagues and subordinates had started to change. He approached each case with renewed focus, making sure to carefully review every detail, no longer relying on assumptions or the idea that he could predict outcomes based on rank or appearances. He made a conscious effort to listen more, to give every person who stood before him the respect they deserved, regardless of their background or position. And as he began to do this, something remarkable happened. The people around him began to respond differently. His courtroom became less tense, more collaborative. Officers who once seemed to shrink under his authority now spoke freely, knowing their voices would be heard. It wasn't just about fairness in the legal sense. It was about respecting the humanity of everyone involved. Judge Mitchell knew that this was a work in progress, but the journey he had begun felt different from any he had embarked on before. His mind was more open, his understanding broader. His authority, he realized, was not diminished by acknowledging his mistakes. It was strengthened. One afternoon, while preparing for another session, Mitchell was handed a case file. As he scanned the details, he was surprised to find a familiar name in the list of witnesses: Lieutenant Colonel Olivia Thomas. She had become known for her leadership and decisiveness, and her reputation had only grown since the hearing they had shared. When the day came for her to testify, she entered the courtroom with the same quiet dignity as before. But this time, Mitchell saw her in a different light. She wasn't just the subject of a past case. She was an equal, a peer, and he had come to respect her not only for her rank, but for the way she carried herself, the quiet strength she exuded, and the intelligence she brought to every conversation. Their eyes met as she entered, and for a brief moment, there was a shared acknowledgement between them. Neither spoke, but in that glance, Mitchell could feel the change that had taken place. He no longer saw her as someone to be judged or questioned. He saw her as a colleague, a leader in her own right. After the proceedings, as the courtroom emptied, Captain, no, Lieutenant Colonel, Thomas approached his bench. She stopped just short of it, her posture as composed as ever, but there was something warmer in her demeanor now. Judge Mitchell, she said, her voice calm yet carrying an undertone of appreciation. I wanted to thank you for how you've handled things lately. You've been fair. Mitchell looked up, surprised, but he nodded. It's the least I could do. Thank you for your patience and your example. As she turned and walked out, Mitchell felt a sense of peace settle over him. The road ahead would still be difficult. He knew that, but today, for the first time in a long while, he felt confident that he was on the right path. He had learned a valuable lesson from Captain Thomas, not just about leadership, but about respect, fairness, and the need to constantly challenge his own assumptions. For the first time, Mitchell understood that true authority came not from rank, but from the ability to admit mistakes, learn, and grow. And as he watched Lieutenant Colonel Thomas leave, he knew he had taken the first step toward becoming the kind of judge and person he could truly be proud of.